On November 28, 1812, at the Berezina River crossing in what is now Belarus, a Russian officer named General Langeron witnessed something that would haunt military chronicles for 2 centuries. Amid the chaos of 30,000 civilians and 25,000 soldiers dying under Russian artillery fire, he observed a young woman on horseback, perhaps 25 years old, riding with her 4-year-old daughter clutched before her. When a cannonball struck her horse and shattered her leg, rendering escape impossible, witnesses reported she gently kissed the child, then strangled her with her own hands before lying down in the snow to embrace the small corpse and wait for death. This woman was not an anomaly. She was one of approximately 30,000 invisible souls, women, children, and civilian camp followers who marched 3,000 kilometers into Russia with Napoleon's Grande Armée in 1812, and whose catastrophic fate has been overshadowed by the military narrative of Europe's greatest disaster. While historians meticulously document the reduction of 600,000 soldiers to fewer than 100,000 survivors, the parallel extinction of an entire shadow society, complete with its own economy, social hierarchy and birth-to-death life cycle, remains largely unexamined. These were not passive victims trailing behind armies. They were licensed businesswomen selling brandy under artillery fire, laundresses maintaining regimental economies, mothers giving birth at -20 degrees Celsius, and children raised from infancy knowing nothing but military camps. They formed an integral system that kept 600,000 men functional across continental distances until the Russian winter transformed them from economic necessity to dying cargo. This is their story. How an army's invisible infrastructure became 30,000 ghosts, and why understanding their systematic destruction reveals more about the true mechanics and costs of Napoleonic warfare than any battle ever could. If you find this exploration of forgotten history compelling, please subscribe and share this video. Now, let us meet the Shadow Army. The presence of women in Napoleon's army was not accidental or merely tolerated, it was bureaucratically regulated. The decree of July 26, 1800 formalised a system that had existed informally for centuries. It stipulated that each infantry battalion could support 4 women, and each cavalry squadron 2. These women fell into 2 categories: blanchisseuses, who provided laundry and seamstress services, and vivandières or cantinières, who sold food, drink and sundries to soldiers. Each woman received a small circular brass medallion engraved with her name, function and assigned unit. They wore no official uniform but often dressed in repurposed military clothing: greatcoats, cavalry capes, gaiters, and brogans worn over civilian dresses made from linen, wool or canvas. Regulations required them to be married to soldiers, though the definition of marriage was loosely interpreted and sometimes involved convenient arrangements. They were paid small stipends by the government, but their real income came from the goods and services they sold. This was not charity. These women were business people. A cantinière might purchase wine or brandy in bulk when the army was near a supply depot, transport it in her authorised 2-horse cart, and sell it at a substantial markup to soldiers desperate for relief from monotony and hardship. A skilled cantinière could accumulate significant wealth. Historical records show that some purchased property, invested in businesses, and exercised financial independence unusual for women in an era when the Napoleonic Code severely restricted female rights. The system served military purposes. By licensing and regulating camp followers, the army reduced the chaos that had plagued earlier French forces. Prior to the Revolution, some battalions had been trailed by camp followers, outnumbering the soldiers 3 or 4 to 1, slowing marches and consuming scarce supplies. The licensing system imposed order. Women needed official permission, faced military discipline including fines and imprisonment for infractions, and could be expelled if they violated regulations. If a cantinière was caught facilitating looting, hiding stolen goods to resell, her cart would be burned with all her possessions, and she would be paraded before the troops dressed in black, her head shaved to be sent to the rear in disgrace. Regulations were one thing. The reality of campaign life was another. Cantinières accompanied their units into battle. They did not simply wait in camp while men fought. They advanced with the regiments, positioned near enough to provide refreshment during lulls in combat. Sergeant Bourgogne recalled that during a firefight, cantinières would move among the soldiers distributing brandy from their small casks, telling men they could pay tomorrow, if they survived. This exposed them to extraordinary danger. Contemporary accounts describe Cantinières pulling wounded soldiers to safety under fire, using their carts as makeshift ambulances, and continuing to dispense supplies even as artillery shells landed nearby. Some learned to fire muskets and defended themselves when necessary. The behaviour of these women during the Moscow retreat would, in the words of one historian, speak volumes about their loyalty to the regiments they served. Beyond the combat zone, their daily labour was essential. In an era before industrial laundry or mechanised food preparation, keeping hundreds of men fed and clothed required intensive manual work. Laundresses worked with primitive equipment, heating water over open fires, scrubbing uniforms by hand, and attempting to dry clothing in whatever weather prevailed. Cantinières prepared meals, maintained their carts and animals, negotiated with local suppliers, and managed their finances. They were entrepreneurs operating in one of the most challenging business environments imaginable. A mobile military campaign where supply lines were uncertain, currency fluctuated, and your market might be annihilated in a single afternoon's battle. The children born to these military families occupied a peculiar position. Male children were explicitly recognised by military regulation. Under the law of July 26, 1800, each regiment was permitted to support 2 male children at government expense. Girls were supported through voluntary donations from soldiers. These were not honorary positions. Boys were educated by senior sergeants in literacy, mathematics, and military drill. At age 14, they were apprenticed to armourers, sappers, or musicians. At 16, they enlisted as soldiers. This created what was essentially a hereditary military caste. A boy born in a military camp raised among soldiers, trained from childhood in military skills, and enlisted as a teenager knew no other life. These children represented a valuable pipeline of future non-commissioned officers who understood army life instinctively because they had never known anything else. The records of one cantinière, Catherine, and her husband illustrate this system. She bore 4 sons, Vendel, Pierre, Louis, and François, all enrolled as enfants de troupe, children of the regiment in their father's unit. The twins, Vendel and Pierre, both joined the regimental band at age 14 in May 1810, and became drummers by 1812. When the retreat from Moscow began, they were 16 years old. Regimental records state that both boys were left behind during the retreat from Russia on December 2nd and December 4th, 1812, respectively. That bureaucratic phrase conceals an almost unimaginable tragedy. Teenage boys, raised in the army from birth, abandoned to freeze or be captured as the Grande Armée disintegrated around them. By June 1812, when the invasion of Russia began, the Grande Armée's shadow population had become an integral component of its operational capability. These were not parasitic followers draining resources. They were the army's logistical infrastructure, performing services without which soldiers could not have maintained equipment, obtained hot meals, or supplemented inadequate official rations. When the campaign began to go catastrophically wrong, these civilians would pay the same price as the soldiers, and in many cases a higher one. The invasion began on June 24, 1812, when the multinational Grande Armée crossed the Neman River. The force that entered Russia numbered approximately 453,000 combat troops, with an additional 150,000 following in subsequent weeks. Among them were those 50,000 civilians, a vast support network that stretched the army's marching columns for dozens of miles. The initial advance was characterised not by combat but by attrition. Napoleon expected to force a decisive battle within weeks, destroy the Russian army, and compel Tsar Alexander I to negotiate. Instead, the Russians adopted a strategy of strategic withdrawal, retreating deeper into their vast territory, burning crops and driving livestock eastward, denying the invaders food and fodder. Within the first 8 weeks of the campaign, before any major battle was fought, Napoleon's army had diminished by approximately 1/3. Soldiers and camp followers alike suffered from heat exhaustion during forced marches in summer temperatures. Dysentery spread through units drinking contaminated water. Horses died by the thousands, collapsing in their traces from overwork and insufficient feed. When horses died, carts were abandoned. When carts were abandoned, the women who operated them either acquired new transport or began walking. On August 17, 1812, the French fought their way into Smolensk, a city the Russians had partially destroyed as they retreated. The city that Napoleon had hoped would provide a major supply base yielded far less than expected. Nevertheless, for the camp followers, Smolensk represented a critical resupply point. Cantinières replenished their stocks of wine, brandy and foodstuffs. Laundresses found soap and firewood. Families secured provisions. The decisive engagement came on September 7th at Borodino, 70 miles west of Moscow. This was the bloodiest single day of the entire Napoleonic Wars. French casualties exceeded 30,000. Russian casualties approached 45,000. The battle was technically a French victory in that the Russians withdrew, but it was a Pyrrhic one. The Grande Armée had been bled heavily, and the Russian army, though retreating, remained intact and increasingly determined. For the camp followers, Borodino was a revelation of the campaign's true nature. Cantinières, who advanced with their units, found themselves in the midst of apocalyptic slaughter. Artillery fire turned the battlefield into a landscape of craters and body parts. Some women were killed by stray rounds. Others worked frantically to help evacuate wounded men, their carts transformed from businesses into ambulances. After the battle, the fields were covered with tens of thousands of dead and dying. The wounded who could not walk faced a grim calculus. Those who secured transport to the rear might survive. Those who could not would die where they fell or be captured by Russian forces. One legend from this period concerns Marie Tête de Bois, a cantinière whose story would become emblematic of these women's experiences. Marie had been born at Les Invalides in Paris, grew up in the military hospital there, married a grenadier in 1805, and followed him on campaign. At the Battle of Marengo, she'd given birth near the battlefield. When she went into labour, passing soldiers reportedly called out, "Hey Marie, you dropped something." She would serve in 17 campaigns. At Borodino, she was in the thick of the fighting, dispensing brandy to the Imperial Guard as they advanced. Her life expectancy, like everyone else's, was now measured in weeks. On September 14th, 1812, Napoleon entered Moscow. He found a nearly deserted city. The Russian High Command had evacuated the civilian population and most supplies. That night, fires began across the city, set by Russian patriots determined to deny the French shelter and sustenance. Within days, 3/4 of Moscow had burned. What Napoleon had expected to be comfortable winter quarters became a charred ruin. For the camp followers, Moscow's destruction was catastrophic. The plan had been to winter there, for Cantinières to establish more permanent establishments, for children to be sheltered from the cold, for the army to recover and resupply. Instead, they found themselves in a wasteland. Some supplies remained in surviving buildings, and there was frantic looting as soldiers and civilians alike scrambled for food, warm clothing and firewood. Discipline began to erode. Sergeant Bourgogne's memoir describes a surreal evening in occupied Moscow. French soldiers found elaborate costumes from various nations, including dresses from the era of Louis XV, all in beautiful materials. They decided to hold a ball. Their cantinière, Madame Dubois, wore a stunning Russian national dress of gold and silver brocade. They drank punch and danced until 4 in the morning. When Madame Dubois left, still wearing the valuable dress, the sergeant of the guard saw a strange woman in the street and attempted to accost her. She fought him off and escaped. This bizarre interlude, a masquerade ball in a burning city, a cantinière in stolen Russian finery defending herself from her own army's guard, captures the increasingly desperate and chaotic atmosphere. Napoleon waited in Moscow for a month, hoping Tsar Alexander would negotiate. He did not. The Russian emperor understood that winter would be a more effective weapon than any army. On October 19, 1812, with supplies dwindling and winter approaching, Napoleon gave the order to retreat. The Grande Armée, now numbering approximately 110,000 soldiers, began the long march west. With them came the civilians, cantinières with their carts, laundresses, families, and children. Some estimate that 20,000 to 30,000 civilians began the retreat from Moscow. Almost none of them would reach safety. The retreat began in relatively good order. Napoleon initially planned to march southwest toward Kaluga, following a route through territory that had not yet been devastated by the summer's advance. But on October 24th, at Maloyaroslavets, he found the Russian army blocking his path. Rather than force another major battle, he chose to return along the same road the army had advanced on, a road already stripped bare of supplies, littered with unburied dead from the advance, and now lined with Russian forces ready to harass the retreating columns. By November 12th, at Vyazma, Napoleon's force had already fallen to 55,000 soldiers. The civilians followed in proportion. Perhaps 12,000 to 15,000 now trudged with the army. It had not yet snowed significantly. The majority of casualties resulted from hunger, disease, exhaustion, and Russian attacks. The myth that winter destroyed Napoleon's army is only partially true. The killing began long before winter set in. The retreat became a running battle. Russian forces under Miloradovich attacked the French rearguard near Vyazma, creating chaos among the wagons, artillery and camp followers. Artillery fire tore into the packed columns. 6,000 French soldiers were killed or wounded. Another 2,000 were captured. Civilians caught in the fighting had no weapons and no training. They could only run or hide. Many died. On the night of November 6, 1812, the first major snowstorm struck. The temperature plummeted. Sergeant Bourgogne recorded that evening as the moment everything changed. His unit's Cantinière, Madame Dubois, the same woman who had worn the Russian dress at the Moscow ball, went into labour. The Grenadiers, understanding that she could not give birth on the open road, constructed a shelter from pine branches. Their colonel personally lent his cloak to cover the structure, and there, in sub-zero temperatures, as the first blizzard of the Russian winter howled outside, Madame Dubois delivered a child. The baby's fate is not recorded. Most likely the infant died within hours or days. In that temperature, without adequate shelter, warmth or nutrition, survival was impossible. What is recorded is that Madame Dubois herself survived, continued with the army, and remained a functioning cantinière for some time afterward, a testament to extraordinary resilience. François Dumonceau, marching with the same column, described the night of November 6th in his diary. Our campfires, which we could only keep going with difficulty, did not succeed in warming us. The biting north wind came and found me even under the bearskin rug I was covered with. Frozen on one side, scorched on the other, suffocated by the smoke, alarmed by the roar of the wind as it tore at the trees of the dense wood, I could not bear it, and, like the others, ran this way and that in order to warm myself, spending a night without rest, and experiencing suffering the like of which we had never imagined. The morning of November 7th revealed a new horror. Faber Dufour, a Württemberger serving in Ney's corps, came upon a camp of makeshift shelters constructed from pine branches. He assumed his countrymen were still asleep. Approaching closer, he realized they were frozen to death. They had built shelters, gone to sleep, and never woken. The cold had killed them in their sleep. This would become routine. By mid-November, the Grande Armée had ceased to function as a disciplined military force. It was now a massive, chaotic column of starving, freezing people, stretching sometimes 20 miles, sometimes 60, depending on conditions. Soldiers became separated from their units. Wagons broke down and were abandoned, blocking the road. Discipline collapsed. Stragglers fell behind and were killed by Cossack raiders or died of exposure. The camp followers suffered disproportionately. Soldiers, at least theoretically, were part of organised units with officers responsible for maintaining some degree of order and cohesion. Civilians had no such structure. When a cantinière's horses died, she was stranded. When a laundress could no longer keep up with the march, she was left behind. Children too young to walk had to be carried. When parents could no longer carry them, they were abandoned. Historical accounts from the retreat include recurring references to frozen children found by the roadside. The competition for resources became savage. When a horse slipped and fell, soldiers and civilians would swarm it, hacking at it with swords and knives even before it died. Caulaincourt, Napoleon's aide, described men too cold and starving to wait for an animal to expire, cutting meat from living horses still struggling to rise. Blood was drunk. Organs were consumed raw because there was no time or fuel to cook them. This was not occasional barbarism. This was routine survival behaviour. Cantinières, who had operated businesses based on selling food and drink, now had nothing to sell and no one to sell to. Their role transformed. Some used their carts, if they still had carts, to transport wounded. Others simply became refugees, part of the mass of humanity flowing westward, hoping to reach safety before they froze or starved. Contemporary observers noted that women and children appear to die at higher rates than soldiers. There are multiple reasons for this. First, they were not issued military clothing. Soldiers had uniforms, greatcoats, and boots designed for campaigning. Women and children wore civilian clothing offering less protection against the cold. Second, they were not part of the military hierarchy. When rations were distributed, soldiers received them first. When wagons were allocated for transport, military equipment took priority. When space around campfires was contested, soldiers won. Third, women and children were more vulnerable to assault. Russian forces showed no mercy to French stragglers, but accounts suggest women faced particular brutality. Cossacks, in particular, were notorious for their treatment of civilians. Captured women could expect rape, robbery, and abandonment in the snow. Children were simply killed or left to freeze. The archaeological evidence supports these accounts. When mass graves from the retreat were excavated near Vilnius in 2001, they contained approximately 3,000 bodies. Among them were women and children. DNA analysis revealed that these individuals died from a combination of factors: paratyphoid fever caused by Salmonella enterica, spread through contaminated food and water; relapsing fever caused by Borrelia recurrentis, transmitted by lice that infested everyone in the retreating army; and of course, cold and starvation. One historian, examining the mass grave findings, noted that the presence of women and children in these military contexts, buried alongside soldiers, indicated they had died as part of the army's retreat, not as local civilians. These were camp followers who had marched all the way from the Neman to Moscow and died trying to return. By late November, the Grande Armée approached the Berezina River, which marked a critical crossing point on the route back to Poland. The river was not fully frozen, preventing crossing on foot, but ice floes made navigation impossible. Russian forces under Admiral Chichagov had captured the bridge at Borisov and burned it. The French were trapped. Napoleon ordered engineers to construct 2 bridges upstream at Studienka. Working in freezing water, many of the engineers died of hypothermia during construction, but the bridges were completed on the night of November 25th, 26. The crossing began the next morning. What followed was one of the worst disasters of the entire retreat. Tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians and stragglers converged on the bridges. The columns became compressed into a desperate mob. People were crushed, trampled, or pushed into the freezing river. Russian artillery began firing into the packed masses. Cossacks attacked stragglers on the eastern bank. Panic spread. For 3 days the crossing continued. Cantinières trying to get their carts across found it impossible. Most abandoned them and crossed on foot if they could. Mothers carrying children were swept into the river. The old, the wounded, and the weak were trampled. When the last French units crossed on November 29th, Napoleon ordered the bridges burned to prevent Russian pursuit. Approximately 10,000 stragglers, mostly civilians, were still on the eastern bank. They were left behind to be killed or captured. Estimates suggest that between 20,000 and 30,000 people died at the Berezina, drowned, crushed, shot, frozen or captured and subsequently killed. Among them were uncounted numbers of women and children. After the Berezina, the retreat entered its final phase. The Grande Armée now numbered fewer than 10,000 combat-effective soldiers and perhaps 40,000 stragglers. The civilians still alive at this point numbered in the hundreds, not thousands. Most had died. On December 5th, Napoleon abandoned the army, travelling ahead by sled to return to Paris before news of the disaster could undermine his political position. He left Marshal Murat in command. The army continued west, now in bitter, deep cold, temperatures dropping as low as negative 31 degrees Fahrenheit. On December 14th, 1812, the remnants of the Grande Armée crossed the Neman River, exiting Russian territory. Of the approximately 612,000 men who had invaded Russia, fewer than 70,000 survived to cross back into Poland. Of these, only about 10,000 were still capable of fighting. Accompanying them were perhaps 500 to 700 women, a tiny fraction of the 3,000 who had marched eastward in June. The precise number of civilian dead will never be known. If 50,000 civilians accompanied the invasion, and fewer than 1,000 returned, the death rate exceeded 98%. That means more than 45,000 women, children, merchants and servants died between June and December 1812. They died of hunger, cold, disease and violence. They died giving birth in snowstorms, collapsed on frozen roads, murdered by raiders, or left behind to freeze when they could not keep up. And history recorded almost none of their names. The destruction of the Grande Armée marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. The 1812 campaign demonstrated that he was not invincible. Within months, Prussia and Austria, previously cowed into alliance, switched sides and joined the coalition against France. Napoleon would raise new armies in 1813 and 1814, but they lacked the quality and experience of the Grande Armée he had led into Russia. Critically, Napoleon could not replace the horses lost in 1812. An estimated 200,000 horses died during the campaign. French cavalry, once the finest in Europe, never recovered. In the battles of 1813 and 1814, French forces were repeatedly outmanoeuvred by Allied cavalry, a factor many historians identify as decisive in Napoleon's eventual defeat. For the camp followers, the institutional response was mixed. The army did not abandon the system of licensed cantinières and laundresses. They remained an integral part of French military operations through the 19th century, serving in the Crimean War, in colonial campaigns in Algeria and Mexico, and remaining on the rolls until just before World War I. But the 1812 disaster led to stricter limits on numbers and more aggressive enforcement of regulations designed to prevent civilians from slowing military movements. The retreat from Moscow ended in December 1812. Napoleon would raise new armies, fight new campaigns, and ultimately be defeated and exiled. The story of the Grande Armée would be told and retold for 2 centuries, focusing on battles, tactics, and the emperor's genius and hubris. But the story of the 30,000 to 50,000 civilians who accompanied that army, who provided essential services, who suffered and died alongside the soldiers, has remained largely untold. This is not because their experiences were unimportant. It is because military history has traditionally focused on men with weapons, not on the women and children who made those men's campaigns possible. Understanding the full scope of the 1812 catastrophe requires accounting for these invisible people. The death toll was not 400,000 soldiers. It was 400,000 soldiers plus 45,000 civilians, approximately 450,000 human beings who entered Russia and did not return. That number represents sons and husbands, daughters and wives, fathers and mothers, children and infants. It represents businesses destroyed, families annihilated, communities erased. The Shadow Army marched with Napoleon's Grande Armée from the Neman to Moscow and back. They cooked meals and washed uniforms. They sold brandy under fire and gave birth in blizzards. They endured everything the soldiers endured, and then they died in even greater proportions because they had fewer protections and fewer resources, and history forgot them. This is their story. Recovered from archives and archaeological sites, pieced together from memoirs and military records. They were not invisible. We simply were not looking. If this kind of dark, untold military history interests you, please consider subscribing to the channel, leaving a like, and sharing this video. These stories deserve to be told and remembered. The people whose names we do not know deserve to be mourned as much as the famous generals and celebrated soldiers. Thank you for watching.